Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at some beliefs that are really interesting and, maybe even a little bit controversial.
Okay.
So we're going to be diving into God's Watchman. It's a booklet
Okay.
by a Pastor Alton Billingsley.
All right.
And it goes into, biblical prophecy,
Right.
history, a bit of a twist,
Yeah.
It focuses on this idea of a watchman.
Interesting.
But here's where it gets kind of interesting. Billingsley, he connects these, kind of old ideas to Herbert W. Armstrong.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Who's, kind of a controversial 20th century religious leader.
Right. Right.
And Billingsley makes some pretty bold claims
Yeah.
about the state of society today.
Yeah.
And what he sees as like signs of impending doom.
I see. Well, this is going to be good. So how does Billingsley use the Bible to back up these claims?
Well, he uses the biblical prophet Ezekiel as like the model for this watchman.
Oh, interesting.
This person who's, tasked with warning people about danger.
Right. Of course. Yeah.
But then he applies that to Armstrong, which, given Armstrong's history and teachings, that raises a few questions.
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, the Watchman analogy, it's usually used to talk about, prophets warning about turning away from God and the consequences,
Exactly, yeah. And it feels like maybe Billingsley's kind of picking and choosing what he wants to use to fit what he's trying to say. What do you think about that?
It's definitely a very selective interpretation.
Yeah.
In traditional Christianity, a watchman it's symbolic.
Right.
It's prophets calling people back to God's covenant.
Right.
So Ezekiel, he warned the Israelites about their idolatry,
Right.
social injustice. He was urging them to, repent and come back to God's law.
Okay, so he was warning them and saying, hey, get back on track.
Exactly. But Billingsley, he seems to be using the idea of the watchman more to predict specific events. And he's associating it with Armstrong,
Right.
who honestly deviated quite a bit from mainstream Christian doctrine.
Okay, so let's talk about Armstrong for a second because, some people might not know who he is. Can you give us a little background on him?
Sure. Herbert W. Armstrong.
Yeah.
He was a very charismatic leader.
Okay.
Founded the Worldwide Church of God.
Okay.
And, he got a big following in the mid-20th century.
Right.
With his radio broadcasts, his publications, all about biblical prophecy.
Okay, so he was a big deal.
Yeah, he was. But his teachings, which came to be called Armstrongism, they often strayed from orthodox Christianity.
Okay.
He redefined certain core beliefs.
Okay.
Introduced these new interpretations. That, just weren't accepted by the mainstream denominations.
Okay, so I've heard about Armstrongism, but it's always seemed a little mysterious.
Yeah.
What were some of the, key differences between his teachings and, traditional Christian teachings?
One of the biggest was his rejection of the Trinity.
Oh, wow.
Which is, a very core doctrine in Christianity.
Right, absolutely.
It affirms the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit as one God.
Right.
But he also put a lot of emphasis on Old Testament laws and rituals.
Okay.
Including dietary restrictions.
Okay.
Observing the Sabbath on Saturday.
Right.
Which most Christian denominations don't do in the same way.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, it is. And then his interpretations of biblical prophecy, they often led to very specific predictions about world events.
Right.
And as we know, some of those didn't happen.
Right, they didn't come true.
Yeah.
So how does Billingsley, he calls himself a Christian pastor, how does he reconcile those differences?
Right.
Because he's saying that Armstrong is a modern-day prophet.
Right.
But Armstrong's teachings disagree with traditional Christianity in some really important ways.
It is really interesting, yeah. It seems like Billingsley is operating within a specific branch of Armstrongism. So he's part of a group that came out of Armstrong's original movement.
Right.
But it's probably evolved in its own way.
Okay.
And it's not unusual for these offshoots to develop their own interpretations,
Right.
And they often elevate certain figures to almost prophetic status.
Oh, okay. So you're saying even within Armstrongism, there are variations and subgroups.
Oh, absolutely. After Armstrong died in 86, the Worldwide Church of God, they went through a huge doctrinal shift.
Right.
Moving closer to mainstream evangelical Christianity.
Oh, interesting.
But that led to all these splinter groups forming.
Right, so everybody went their own way.
Yeah, exactly. And each one held on to different parts of Armstrong's original teachings or interpretations.
Okay.
And that's where Billingsley comes in. He's presenting his perspective from within that context.
It's wild how these movements, they kind of evolve, they splinter. Yeah. Everybody's saying, we've got the real truth.
Yeah.
It's really interesting how, people search for certainty and meaning, even when there's like conflicting information or, prophecies that didn't happen.
Yeah, that's human nature, right. And that actually brings us to a pretty big moment in Armstrong's history. His prediction that the world would end in 1975.
Oh, right.
That was a big one.
Yeah, that was a big one.
And it caused a real crisis in his church.
Yeah.
A lot of followers left.
Right.
And others just dug in even deeper.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine, like, the disillusionment.
Yeah.
And the turmoil.
Oh, yeah.
That must have caused. So how does Billingsley deal with that? Does he try to explain that away? Or did he just pretend it never happened?
He doesn't shy away from it.
Okay.
But he frames it in a way that keeps Armstrong's authority intact.
Interesting.
So Billingsley argues that even though the timing of the end times might have been wrong,
right.
Armstrong was still chosen by God to, deliver this really important message.
Yeah.
He suggests that God might have, delayed the end.
Oh, okay.
For strategic reasons.
Okay.
Or to give people more time to repent.
Interesting. So it's a bit of a balancing act, isn't it? To try and maintain this image of Armstrong as this, divinely appointed watchman.
Yeah.
While also acknowledging that he got things wrong.
It is.
So does Billingsley give any evidence for this idea that God might have, changed the schedule? Or is it just based on faith?
It's mostly interpretation.
Okay.
And reinterpreting certain Bible passages to fit his narrative.
So he's finding what he wants to find to support what he's saying.
Yeah, pretty much. He's drawing on this common thread in apocalyptic thinking, which is that prophecy is often symbolic and can be interpreted in multiple ways.
Right. It could be vague.
Exactly. So he's basically saying that Armstrong might have gotten the overall pattern of events right, but just got the specific time frame wrong.
It makes you think about how much, wiggle room there is. When you're interpreting these prophecies,
right?
Is it about finding, the right code? Or is it about, making the message fit what you already believe?
That's a really big question.
Right.
And theologians and scholars have been debating that for centuries.
Yeah.
And what Billingsley's doing, it just highlights how people can have this confirmation bias.
Oh, okay.
Where they seek out information.
Right.
And they interpret it.
Right.
In a way that just confirms their beliefs.
Right. Even if there's evidence that contradicts it.
Exactly.
So he's really just kind of pushing a specific story.
Yeah.
Instead of looking at Armstrong's teachings in the historical context in a really objective way.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. And it's a little concerning.
Yeah.
Because that kind of approach makes it really hard to have these open and honest discussions.
Yeah, for sure.
About complicated topics. When somebody claims to have, the exclusive truth,
right.
It often shuts down critical thinking.
Right.
And you can't have healthy debate.
Yeah, you just shut down the whole conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's something we really need to be careful of, especially with groups that, claim to have this special knowledge or authority.
Right.
It's easy to get caught up in what they're saying, but you have to kind of keep your distance and ask the tough questions.
Absolutely. And speaking of tough questions, we can't avoid the accusations about Armstrong being a cult leader.
Right.
I mean, Billingsley would probably deny that.
Yeah.
But it's a big part of Armstrong's legacy.
Oh.
It needs to be addressed.
Yeah. That's a heavy topic.
Yeah.
I think before we go there, we need to take a step back and define what cult leader even means.
Yeah.
And what makes a group a cult.
Okay.
Then we can look at how Armstrong's actions and his teachings fit or don't fit with those characteristics.
That's a great idea because the word cult gets thrown around a lot.
Right.
Without people really understanding what it means.
Yeah.
Sociologically.
Right.
Theologically.
Right.
It's a discussion that we need to have with nuance and sensitivity.
Right.
We can't generalize or be sensational.
Right. Yeah, we need to be careful.
Okay, so when we're talking about cult leader, what does that mean?
Right.
Sociologists, researchers who study cults, they tend to look for certain things.
Okay.
It might be a charismatic authoritarian leader.
Right.
Demands absolute loyalty.
Okay.
A system of beliefs that isolates members from the outside world.
Okay.
Practices that involve manipulation, control, exploitation.
Right. So there's a whole range of groups then, it sounds like.
Yes.
From relatively harmless to, really dangerous.
Yeah, for sure.
Where would you say Armstrong falls on that?
It's tough to say, really. Opinions are all over the place. Some former members and critics, they accused Armstrong of creating a culture of fear and control in his church.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Alleging that, he demanded strict obedience to his teachings,
Okay.
discouraged critical thinking,
Right.
and used his authority to manipulate people's lives.
So how does Billingsley address that? Does he acknowledge any of that?
Not really.
Okay.
He tends to say it was just misunderstandings
Right.
or attacks from people who didn't like Armstrong's message.
Right. So anybody who disagreed.
Yeah, pretty much. He presents Armstrong as a strong leader
Okay.
who is just trying to uphold God's truth in a world that had strayed from it.
So it's really just a matter of perspective then.
It seems that way, yeah.
From Billingsley's point of view, Armstrong was a strong leader.
Right.
He was just trying to maintain order,
Yeah.
doctrinal purity.
Exactly.
But to other people, it probably felt really oppressive.
Yeah, I can see that.
Controlling.
Yeah. That's why it's so important to listen to everybody's side of the story when
Yeah.
you're studying these groups. You need to think about the people who felt hurt or manipulated,
Right.
but also the people who felt like they found meaning and purpose in Armstrong's teachings.
So you have to look at it from all sides.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that what one person thinks is the truth, somebody else might find really troubling.
Absolutely.
It also makes you think about how we have to be careful as critical thinkers.
Yeah,
We can't judge just based on one person's story.
right, for sure. And it's important to note that even within Armstrongism, there's a lot of different opinions
Right.
about Armstrong's leadership and his legacy.
Okay.
Some groups have completely distanced themselves from his more controversial stuff,
Okay.
and others still see him as a prophet.
So it's kind of all over the place, even within the movement.
It is, yeah. Navigating all these different beliefs and interpretations can be really tough.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can someone, approach this stuff in a way that's open-minded, but also, careful?
I think healthy skepticism is really important.
Okay.
While still being respectful of different viewpoints,
Right.
ask questions,
Right.
compare different sources,
Okay.
see if you can spot any patterns or inconsistencies.
So it's almost like you're a detective, trying to figure out what really happened.
Exactly.
And what people's motives were.
Right. And speaking of piecing things together,
Yeah.
let's look at how Billingsley uses historical events to support his views.
Okay.
He relies a lot on the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right.
He presents it as a cautionary tale for modern society.
Oh, interesting. So he's saying we're like Sodom and Gomorrah.
Kind of, yeah. It's a pretty common theme in apocalyptic literature.
Right. Using history as like a warning.
Right, exactly. So what's interesting is how Billingsley's take on Sodom and Gomorrah is different from the traditional interpretation.
Okay. So what does he say?
He focuses on the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah as being directly connected to what he sees as moral decay in society today.
Okay. So he's drawing a parallel there.
Exactly. He points to things like interracial marriage and alcohol abuse as evidence that we're, going downhill.
Wow. Okay.
He says it's like what happened in those cities.
That's interesting because when I think of the traditional interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah,
Yeah.
it's usually about different sins.
Right.
Like pride,
Yeah.
inhospitality,
Mhm.
lack of compassion.
Yeah, you're right.
It's seen as a warning against turning away from God.
Yeah.
But the specific sins can vary.
Absolutely. And Billingsley's focus on things like interracial marriage,
Right.
alcohol abuse,
Right.
it reflects a very specific social and cultural viewpoint
Right.
that might not line up with other Christian perspectives.
So maybe he's bringing his own biases into it.
It's possible, and it's worth pointing out that using historical events to condemn specific behaviors,
Right.
it can be dangerous because it often means taking those events out of their historical and cultural context.
So he's kind of picking and choosing what fits his narrative.
It seems like it. It raises the question of whether he's trying to genuinely understand the meaning of Sodom and Gomorrah
Right.
or just using it to reinforce his own worldview.
So he has his own agenda.
Potentially. And we see this pattern a lot in apocalyptic thinking, reinterpreting history
Right.
to fit a certain prophetic timeline or agenda.
So like twisting things to fit what they want to believe.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's crucial to remember that these interpretations,
Right.
They're subjective.
Right.
They can be influenced by personal biases or cultural assumptions.
So we have to take it with a grain of salt.
Absolutely.
It's like some groups interpret what's happening in the world today
Yeah.
through this lens of biblical prophecy.
Right.
Like they see natural disasters or political upheaval
Yeah.
as signs of the end times,
Exactly.
which can be pretty scary.
It can be, yeah. It can also lead to this fatalistic worldview.
Right, like there's nothing we can do.
Exactly.
It's all going to end anyway.
Right. And that's dangerous.
Yeah, it is. So we need to look at these interpretations carefully.
Yeah,
And consider other viewpoints.
definitely. Are these events really signs of God's judgment? Right.
Or are there other reasons they're happening?
Right.
Are we reading too much into these things?
Right.
Or are we missing something important?
Right. Yeah. These are big questions.
They are big questions we need to grapple with, honestly.
And thoughtfully.
Yeah.
It's like we're trying to crack a code. We have to be careful not to force our own ideas onto the text or events. We have to try and understand them in the right context.
Absolutely. And remember, even within Christianity,
Right.
there are different ways of interpreting biblical prophecy
Okay.
and how it relates to current events. Not every Christian believes we're living in the end times.
Oh, okay. So there's a diversity of opinion there.
Oh, for sure.
We can't just assume that all Christians believe what one person or one group is saying.
Exactly. And that diversity should encourage us to have conversations,
Right.
respectful dialogues,
Right?
to learn from each other.
Right. Even if we don't agree. Exactly. So we've talked about Billingsley's view of the Watchman and his warnings about the end times.
Right.
What other things does he talk about in God's Watchman?
Yeah, what else?
He talks about this concept of the Philadelphia remnant.
The Philadelphia remnant. Okay.
Yeah, the select group of believers
Okay.
who will supposedly be saved from this coming tribulation.
Okay. So, like, they're the chosen few.
Yeah, kind of. And this idea,
All right.
it taps into this long history of exclusivity,
Okay.
elitism,
Right.
within religious movements. It often creates this us versus them mentality,
Oh, right.
which can be very divisive.
So Billingsley's painting a pretty dark picture, it sounds like.
He is, yeah. He's using biblical prophecy, historical events,
Right.
to present this pretty bleak view of the present and a potentially even worse future.
Yeah.
But he also offers a glimmer of hope
Okay.
to those who align themselves with his interpretations.
Oh.
He suggests that they'll be part of this chosen few who will be saved from judgment.
So he's saying, if you believe what I believe, you'll be okay.
Essentially, yeah. And that's a really important part of his message.
Right.
That only those who understand God's plan,
Right.
as revealed through his interpretations,
Right.
will be saved.
So you have to buy into what he's saying.
Yeah. It creates this feeling of urgency.
Okay.
Like you need to be in the know,
Right.
part of the inner circle.
You have to be in the club.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets a little tricky,
Right.
because when you start claiming to have exclusive access to the truth,
Right.
it can lead to feeling superior.
Right. You're better than everybody else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even looking down on people outside the group.
So it could be pretty dangerous then.
It can be. It's like what we see throughout history.
Yeah.
Claims of exclusivity, special knowledge.
Right.
They've been used to justify all sorts of harmful things.
Yeah.
So we need to be very careful and
Yeah.
think critically about these teachings.
Right. Okay. So we've explored Billingsley's view of the Watchman, his warnings about the end times.
Yeah.
But we haven't really talked about this Philadelphia remnant yet.
Right. The chosen few.
Yeah. Who are they?
Well, he describes them as a group of believers who have remained true to God's teachings,
Okay.
as he interprets them, of course.
Of course. Wait.
They're the ones who have listened to the warnings,
Okay.
repented of their sins,
All right.
and are actively getting ready for the tribulation.
So it's not about being from a specific family or background.
No.
It's about believing certain things,
Yeah, it's about agreeing with Billingsley's understanding of God's plan.
which, as we talked about, it was pretty different from mainstream Christianity.
Very different, yeah.
So it's almost like a self-selecting group then.
It is, yeah.
If you believe what Billingsley believes, you're in.
Right.
What about everyone else?
Exactly. What happens to the people who don't share those beliefs?
Right. Are they automatically condemned?
That's a good question.
And what if he's wrong? You
Yeah.
know, I mean, what if Billingsley's interpretations are just not accurate?
That's the big what if, right?
Yeah.
When you base your whole worldview on one specific interpretation of prophecy,
Right.
it can be tough to change your mind if those predictions don't come true.
That's what we see with apocalyptic movements.
Right.
When prophecies don't happen, it can be really messy.
It can. Disillusionment,
Right.
groups splitting up,
Yeah.
even people becoming more extreme in their beliefs.
So this idea of the Philadelphia remnant,
Yeah.
it might be comforting for some people,
It might, yeah.
but we really need to think critically about it.
Absolutely.
We can't just accept these claims about exclusivity
Right.
and special knowledge.
No. We have to look at the evidence,
Right.
consider other perspectives,
Right.
and ultimately decide for ourselves what we believe.
Well, this has been really fascinating.
It has, yeah.
A little disturbing, but really fascinating.
It is, yeah.
To explore God's Watchman.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for helping us understand these complex ideas.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
So it's like this exclusive club, right?
Yeah.
And to get in, you have to believe in God. Yeah. But you also have to accept his interpretation of prophecy. And you have to align yourself with his picks, like Armstrong. It just seems like a really, really narrow path to salvation.
And that exclusivity can be a big draw for some people. It gives them that sense of certainty, that sense of belonging in a world that feels so chaotic and confusing.
Right.
Knowing you're part of this select group
Right.
that holds the key to understanding God's plan, it can be really comforting.
It's like you've got this secret decoder ring for the universe. But then it also makes you think, like, who gets to decide who's in and who's out? What are the rules? And are those rules really in line with what Christianity teaches?
That's a really important question.
Yeah.
And that's where Billingsley really diverges from traditional Christian beliefs about salvation. Because in mainstream Christianity, salvation is generally understood to be based on God's grace
Right.
and your faith in Jesus Christ.
Okay.
It's not about being part of the right group
Right.
or following a set of rules perfectly.
So it's more about, like, your personal relationship with God
Exactly.
than being part of a club.
Yeah, that's a big difference.
Okay.
And it really sets Billingsley's teachings apart.
So he's basically saying there's a hierarchy
Yeah, kind of.
within Christianity.
Right.
And only the people who follow his interpretation are on the right track.
Yeah, it seems that way.
What does that even mean for people outside the group? Does that mean he has compassion for them?
Right.
Or is he judging them?
That's a really important thing to think about. Because when you believe that you hold the keys to salvation, it can be easy to look down on others.
Right, you're better than them.
Exactly. It can lead to intolerance,
Right,
even hostility
right.
toward people who are seen as being outside of God's favor.
And we see this all the time in history, right? People using religion to justify terrible things.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we need to be careful how we interpret our faith.
Absolutely. So as we finish up our deep dive into God's Watchman, what do you want our listeners to take away from this?
I think the biggest thing is to think critically,
Okay.
especially when you come across teachings that claim to have, like, the exclusive truth.
Right. Be skeptical.
Yeah. Ask questions, compare different sources,
Okay.
and be careful of interpretations that create division.
Right, or make you feel like you're better than other people.
Exactly. It's like being a smart shopper.
Okay.
You don't buy the first thing you see.
Right. You do your research.
Exactly. Don't blindly accept what you're told.
Right. Even if it seems like it's coming from an authority.
Right. And remember, faith is a personal journey.
Right.
There's no single right way to understand God's will.
Yeah. Be open to different perspectives.
Exactly. And talk to each other, even when you disagree.
Great advice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through God's Watchman.
It's been my pleasure. And I would encourage everyone listening to keep digging into these topics.
Yeah.
Form your own opinions. There's always more to learn.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful.
Yeah.
Maybe even a little challenging. But just remember, keep asking questions, think for yourself, and keep searching for a deeper understanding of your faith.
Sure.
Until next time, keep on diving.